This is a short revision video on Jane Eyre. It's basically a plot overview. I'm going to go through every chapter and say what happens in it. Don't expect anything deep about themes or stuff like that. I might do some more videos on those later. This is basically just to remind you of what happens in the book and how it all goes. This sort of thing you can listen to whilst you're eating breakfast or something like that. Chapter 1 opens with Jane Eyre sitting behind the curtain. She's hiding and she's reading Bewick's History of British Birds. Then suddenly John Reed runs in, he has an argument with her. I think he calls her a beast. This sort of opens up the idea that Jane doesn't get on with her cousin. She also talks about the fact she doesn't get on with her cousin. They have a bit of an argument and John Reed ends up throwing a book at Jane, who flies at him because she goes a bit mad. Miss Reed comes in, she blames Jane for the fight and she sends Jane to the Red Room. Miss Abbott and Bessie, who are servants, take Jane to the Red Room. Jane resists. She's terrified of the Red Room. We realise there's loads of negative connotations with this room. It's the first real sign of punishment being a theme within the novel. Jane sees Uncle Reed's ghost, or at least she thinks she does, because obviously ghosts don't exist. She screams, "Ah!" Abbott and Bessie run in. They think Jane's ill. They let her out, but then Miss Reed comes and she's like, "Oh my god, Jane's making it up," and Jane faints. Jane gets looked after by Mr Lloyd, who is a kind apothecary, and he suggests that Jane should be sent off to school. Later on in the chapter, Jane actually overhears Abbott and Bessie talking about her past, so she learns a bit about her past from that, and as the readers, we also learn about her past. We know that Jane Eyre's parents were quite rich, quite respected, but alas, quite soon after Jane died, they contracted typhus and died. Jane's deceased uncle took her in, treated her as one of his own, and then he died, leaving Mrs Reed with her, and that's how we got to where we are now. Mr Brocklehurst, who owns Lowood School for Girls, comes into the house, and Jane has a conversation with him. Jane talks to him and he tells her this story about a boy who would rather learn his psalms than eat a ginger nut, and thus Mr Rocco would give him 2 ginger nuts in reward for saying this. This is quite a random story, but it could be deemed to show the importance of religion in lives and the way Mr Brocklehurst could be quite easily fooled. It could tell you quite a lot about his character. Mrs Reed has a conversation with Mr Brocklehurst too. She calls him a liar, and Mr Brocklehurst promises to warn the school about Jane, which he later on does. Jane argues back with Mrs Reed once Mr Brocklehurst is gone, and essentially her and Mrs Reed separate on really bad terms, but Bessie is quite kind to Jane until she leaves. Despite her young age, Jane travels alone to Lowood School where she meets her classmates. She watches Mrs Scatcherd bully Helen. I believe Helen's meant to wear some placard around her neck saying she's a slag or something. I can't remember, obviously not those terms. Helen and Jane actually become friends at this time. Helen is slightly older than Jane and she teaches Jane a lot about obedience, respect of elders, and sometimes it's not right to fight back and just acceptance of your fate. As you can see, chapter 6 is a really exciting chapter. It's mainly about the strength of the friendship that Jane and Helen build. It also shows Jane's development as a character in learning acceptance and learning to control her emotions. In chapter 7, Mr Brocklehurst returns to Lowood and Jane gets frightened when she sees him and drops her slate. This causes Mr Brocklehurst to notice her, and he gets Jane to come to the front and he tells the school that Jane is a liar and then makes her stand on a stool in silence in front of everybody. She finds this very embarrassing as everyone's walked past her and she's just there standing on a stool. This is another example of punishment. Miss Temple, who is a kind teacher and a maternal figure to Jane, actually invites Jane and Helen to have cake in her room after Jane's punishment. Jane tells Miss Temple she is innocent, so Miss Temple agrees to investigate Jane's past and writes a letter to Mr Lloyd, who tells Miss Temple that Jane is a good girl. So Miss Temple publicly declares to the whole school that Jane is innocent, and the school treats her much nicely after that. In chapter 9, typhus spreads through Lowood. Lots of girls get taken home by their parents and they die at home. Lots of girls just die at school. Helen Burns actually goes to solitary confinement because she gets typhus herself. Jane Eyre goes to visit her one night and Helen tells her she's going home. Yay! Except then it turns out that by home she means heaven. And she actually dies that night and Jane's led away screaming in the morning. Jane goes on to describe Helen's gravestone, which at first was quite plain, but later on Jane wrote Resurgam on it. I think it's Resurgam, and that's Latin for I will rise again. As time goes on, things improve in Lowood after Mr Brocklehurst is blamed for the deaths and the cruelty towards his children. Also in previous chapters, it describes how Mr Brocklehurst refused to give girls extra needles and stuff like that. Jane excels in her studies for 6 years before becoming a teacher at Lowood. After a while, she gets bored of this and advertises as a governess. She later accepts a place at Thornfield from a mysterious Mrs Fairfax, and finally Bessie visits Jane and updates her on the Reed. We discover that John has gone really downhill, addicted to gambling, drinking, that sort of thing, and one of the 2 sisters attempted to run away with a man, but the other sister pointed it out. This is the last that we hear about the Reeds for quite a long time. Bronte probably put it in here to remind us that they still exist and stuff like that, so they can be used as a plot device later on in the novel. Jane then travels to Thornfield and arrives that night. It's quite dark, but she can see that the inside of the house looks quite nice. Mrs Fairfax meets Jane. At first Jane believes that Mrs Fairfax is the owner of the property, but later on she realises she's wrong. Jane meets Adele, who is a little French girl. No one's really sure why she's there. Miss Fairfax has a bit of a gossip with Jane about it, and then they hear this laughter. We don't know it yet, but it's actually Bertha. But Miss Fairfax tells Jane that it's Grace Poole. Grace Poole's the woman that looks after Bertha and is quite drunk quite a lot of the time. At some point later on, Jane goes on a walk and she sees a horse approaching. Thinks she also sees a little dog. Then Rochester falls off the horse, although Jane doesn't realise it's Rochester at this point, and it's right in front of Jane. He accuses Jane of witchery and sorcery. At first it's not a very good impression. This leads to the whole idea of the whole mystical, magical stuff around Jane. She goes from being a horrible witch to being a sprite or a pixie or an elf later on. Jane helps Rochester get back onto his horse and then returns to the house. Later on that evening she discovers it was actually her master, Mr Rochester, on the horse. What a shock. Rochester invites Jane and Adele to have tea with him, and then he asks to see Jane's painting. He also asks to hear Jane play the piano, and she plays it, and he's like, "Oh, you play a little." And then Mrs Fairfax tells Jane that Rochester had a hard past. We don't discover much about this later, but it's hinted at his backstory. This helps to build tension and the air of gothic mystique. Rochester gives Adele a present, which is quite similar to his relationship with Celine Varens, who is Adele's mother. Rochester then chats with Jane and asks her to talk to him, showing his dominance and power. Rochester then asks Jane if she thinks him handsome, and she is very honest and says no. In chapter 15, Rochester tells Jane the story of Celine Varens. Celine Varens is a woman that Rochester believed he had fallen in love with on a trip, I think it was to Europe, maybe France. And they had a short-lived relationship, which mainly consisted of him buying her presents and giving her money and stuff like that. One day he went and hid in their room. I think he might have hid behind some curtains, which is a reflection of Jane at the beginning, hiding behind the curtains. He hid there and he heard her coming in laughing with another man, shock horror. She was calling him ugly and stuff like that. And he got out and he challenged the man to a fight. Grrr. Later that night, Jane hears noises in the house. She wanders through and suddenly sees that Rochester's bed is on fire. Oh no! Jane pours water over Rochester or something, saving his life, and then Rochester goes off to investigate. Later he comes back and tells Jane that it was Grace Poole. As the novel progresses, we realise it was actually Bertha. The next morning, nobody reacts to the fire, which really confuses Jane, and she starts making wild accusations and stories in her head, thinking all about Grace Poole and why it should be Grace Poole and why Grace Poole caused this fire. Rochester then leaves to go have a party with Blanche, and Mrs Fairfax tells Jane all about Blanche, who she describes as really pretty and lovely, and, well, at least lovely looking, and Jane then draws herself, looking really plain, and Blanche Ingram, looking really pretty and lovely, and then she compares them, and she realises that Rochester would never love her in comparison to Blanche. How wrong she was. Rochester then returns with loads of guests, what a popular fellow, and Jane watches the group from a window seat. The Inghams are really impolite about Jane. Then Rochester one night says goodnight to her, and he goes, "Goodnight, my..." and he stops before saying love, which is a hint at a suggestion for the audience that the two are going to fall in love and live happily ever after. It's important to note that this whole Blanche Ingham thing is all about jealousy and making Jane feel jealous. Rochester wants Jane to fall in love with him. In chapter 18, Rochester and his guests play charades. Rochester asks Jane to join in, but she says no and watches as Rochester and Blanche act out Bride and Bridewell, and stuff with the wedding theme like that. Rochester then goes on a day trip, as he says, and suddenly Mason arrives, and followed by a gypsy woman. Blanche goes to see the gypsy woman, and she returns looking bitter. We later learn that it's because the gypsy woman has told Blanche that Rochester is not nearly as rich as she believes him to be. The gypsy woman states that she wants to read the fortunes of every woman in the house, so Jane has to go and have her fortune read. The gypsy woman talks in length to Jane, and then suddenly Jane realises that shock horror, the gypsy is actually Rochester. Jane tells Rochester that Mason has arrived, and then Rochester goes into a massive panic. We'll work out why later. In the middle of the night, Jane hears a cry for help. Ah! Or everyone comes out, they're out of bed. Oh my god, what's going on? And Rochester's there like a servant had a nightmare. And for some reason, everyone believes him and they all go back to bed. Then Rochester gets Jane to care for the stabbed Mason. Rochester then sends Mason away with the doctor and tells Jane a story about a man who made a terrible mistake. It's quite obvious that this man is Rochester. In chapter 21, Jane receives a letter about her family. It turns out that John Reed is dead and her aunt is dying, so she returns to Gateshead. Mrs. Reed is very hostile to Jane, and Jane tries to get her to come to terms, be nice to her. She's like, "Kiss me, aunt," and aunt is like, "No." Mrs Reed that one night shows a letter to Jane from her Uncle John saying he would love to care for her, but Mrs Reed reveals that she's had this letter for years and has hidden it away. Jane tries her hardest to put things right, bless her, but Mrs Reed refuses and then she dies. Rip. Jane remains at Gateshead for quite some time, and she spends a bit of time with her cousins, getting to know them a bit better, have a bit of banter. Then Jane receives a letter from Mrs Fairfax who tells Jane that Rochester has gone to London to buy a carriage. Jane believes that this carriage is for his wedding with Blanche Ingham, so she returns to Thornfield at once, meets Mr Rochester in the grounds, and tells Rochester how happy she is to be in his presence. What a beg. Mrs Fairfax, Adele, and all the other servants greet Jane really warmly, because she's a popular girl. Chapter 23 is most people's favourite chapter, also known as the Garden of Eden chapter, after Jane meets Rochester in, guess what, the gardens. Rochester tells Jane how he plans to marry Blanche. What a cruel liar. Jane gets very upset, and then Rochester proposes. Woohoo! Jane accepts, and then a storm breaks, and Mrs Fairfax there watching astonished, and in the night the chestnut tree splits in two. This is sort of a hint that the wedding isn't going to be quite as it seems, and they're going to split. It's quite a good symbol to use if you're writing about Bronte's use of symbolism within the novel. In chapter 24, Mrs Fairfax is very cold to Jane and tells her that she disapproves of the marriage because men in Mr Rochester's position are not the type of people. They don't tend to marry their governesses. Rochester tells Jane that he's going to dress her in jewels, clear that he has misunderstood Jane's character completely because Jane actually doesn't want to be dressed in jewels. Jane's a bit uncomfortable here, but she's excited, so much so that she writes to her Uncle John about the marriage. The night before the wedding, Jane wakes up to see Bertha there, tearing her veil. Jane tells Rochester, and he says it's Grace Poole. Rochester then tells Jane he will tell her the entire truth after a year and a day. Would he actually? Probably not. This could be deemed to be an omen of what is to come. Chapter 26. Massive climax. Boom, boom, boom. Proper exciting stuff here. Sophie helps to dress Jane for the wedding. And then Jane goes to the church and she sees strangers reading the headstones in the church cemetery. We realise later that this is because they're looking to see whether Bertha has actually died yet. Partly through the service, Briggs runs in and interrupts it, declaring an impediment to the marriage. Mason then talks about Bertha, his sister, who is actually married to Rochester. Oh my gosh! Rochester then takes everybody to go see Bertha. Bertha tries to strangle Rochester because she is mad and deranged, and we hear the story of Bertha. Basically, Rochester married Bertha and then she turned out to be totally mad and he didn't like her at all. Briggs tells Jane that he found out about the marriage from her dying uncle in Madeira, or wherever he came from, because Jane wrote a letter to him. That's how he found out about the marriage. Jane then locks herself in her room and grieves for the loss of Rochester, her fiancé. Jane prays to God, and that's how we end the chapter, with her praying to God. This is Bronte telling the reader that if in doubt, pray. It's a deeply religious book with lots of true moral themes. The next morning, Jane wakes up and realises that she must leave Thornfield. She can't stay here with this cruel Rochester who's trying to trick her into marrying him. She comes out of her room and sees Rochester. He's been sitting there outside her room like a little stalker, though I suppose it is his house. Then Jane faints, blah, after Rochester tells her that he never meant to hurt her. Rochester carries Jane to the library and then tells Jane of his past. From here we get the whole spiel about his father tricking him into marrying Bertha, whom he knew had a disorder that was going to cause her to have a mental breakdown later on, in return for quite a bit of money. We hear how Bertha later went mad, but rather than putting her in a mental asylum like he could have done, Rochester decided to look after her. Jane tells Rochester that she believes him and forgives him at once. Reader, I forgave him, but tells him she still must go, and she kisses Rochester and goes. Goodbye. In chapter 28, Jane has been walking for days, I think it's about 3 days or something altogether. She runs out of money, is forced to sleep outdoors. She begs and receives a slice of bread. Lucky Jane. Then she collapses outside Sinjin's house. Hannah, who's a servant, refuses to let her in, thinking she's a mad, crazy beggar woman. But then Jane prays, and Sinjin answers. This could be Bronte hinting to the reader that Sinjin's very religious, he likes to play God, have all the power. Over the next few chapters we learn that Sinjin's greatest desire is to go to heaven and sit by God's right-hand side. Jane spends the next 3 days recovering in the bed in Sinjin's house. When she wakes up, she lies about her identity. I'm Jane Elliot, she says. Jane feels better on the 4th day and goes downstairs and starts to criticise Hannah for judging her. Hannah then tells Jane about the Rivers' past, how they used to be rich until they got bad advice from a man who turned out to be Jane's father, which caused them to lose all of their money. Then Sinjin toddles in and promises to find Jane a job, which he does do. Jane befriends Diana and Mary, who turn out to be very good, hard-working and willed people, and then they have to return to their posts as governesses because that's the way they make their money. And Sinjin comes in, he's like, I've got a job for you, Jane. You're going to run a charity school for girls in Morton. From this charity school for girls, we learn a lot about education. We also learn that he had this opened a school for boys first. This tells us about the gender discrimination at the time. At the start of chapter 31, we learn a lot about education at that time. If you're writing an essay on it, compare it to Lowood School. We also learn about Jane's character flaws. She judged these children, thinking they were horrible, evil things. Rosamond, who is this lovely woman, Rosamond Oliver, gives Jane a cottage to live in and sleep in. And then one day, Sinjin visits Jane in her school, and I think it's now that he gives her a gift from his sisters, who, some colouring pencils, that sort of thing, so Jane can do a bit of art. Then Rosamond appears, and she flirts with Sinjin, cheeky. Jane believes that Rosamond and Sinjin are in love. Jane decides to draw Rosamond, which is actually a bit creepy. Then Sinjin comes in and sees the painting, and Jane offers to draw him one. He says no, but then sits there, gets out his watch, times a quarter of an hour, or however long he was going to look at the painting for, and just sits there staring at it. This says a lot about Sinjin's character, his refusal to accept his own emotions, his desire to go to join God. Jane then tells Sinjin to marry Rosamond, and John says he loves her, but cannot marry her. Then Sinjin sees something on St. Jane's paper, and he tears off a piece of Jane's paper. I mean, I've got a bit annoyed if that was me, like, what the hell are you doing tearing stuff off my paper? We later learn that what he's seen is Jane Eyre's signature saying Jane Eyre. He's like, oh my god, it's Jane Eyre, my cousin! Wow! One cold evening, Sinjin arrives in Jane's cottage and tells Jane her own story. So basically tells her all about Jane Eyre, who was brought up by a cruel aunt, and so on and so forth, had a relationship with Rochester, went all downhill. And then he tells her that her uncle died, and Jane Eyre's uncle left her £20,000, and Jane's like, oh my god, that's me, I'm Jane Eyre. And then Sinjin explained that he knew because he saw her signature, and he reveals that he is her cousin. Jane then splits the money between her cousins and herself, so they all get £5,000 each, which means they're all really rich. Obviously it doesn't sound like that much money, but in those days this was millions. A lot of money. Jane then closes the school for Christmas and goes to stay with her cousins. Sinjin's actually quite cold to Jane, like when they're saying goodnight. Sinjin hugs them, his sisters and stuff like that, and with Jane he's just like, good night. And then he asks Jane to marry him and travel to India as a missionary. And Jane says no, because they're not in love. She says she would gladly go as his cousin, but not as his wife. And Sinjin angrily leaves the room. He just can't accept this rejection. Bitter. Sinjin then tries to persuade Jane to marry him, tries all sorts of methods to get her to agree. Then one day she hears him praying for her. And we learn from this that Sinjin doesn't want to marry Jane simply for marrying him. He wants to marry her so that she can also go to heaven and sit at God's right hand. Jane actually thinks quite a bit about marrying Sinjin, but then one night she hears Rochester's voice calling to her, Jane, Jane. I know we have to suspend belief here, really gothic bit here. Jane then boards a coach to Thornfield and sees its charred ruin. Goes into a pub and the bartender tells her all about Rochester and what happened to Thornfield. What happened was that one night Bertha set fire to the whole thing. It burnt down and Rochester went back in to try to save Bertha, who ended up, she died. I think she might have jumped off something. Rochester lost sight in both of his eyes and I think one of his limbs was damaged, or maybe both. Quite a lot of him was damaged. He wasn't in a very good way. Jane then goes to Fern to go meet her beloved Rochester. Rochester's blind and he can't see Jane, but Pilot recognises her, and she's like, oh, Pilot recognises me, why can't you? And then he finally recognises, oh my god, it's Jane! And then Jane promises never to leave Rochester. Jane actually gets really sassy in this chapter. Like, you have to read it to understand how sassy she gets, but she just gets so sassy in this chapter. Sassy Jane. This actually shows a major character development from the rather submissive Jane that we had before with Mr Rochester. In chapter 38 we have everybody's favourite line, Reader, I married him. Jane and Rochester have married. Adele grows up to be a fine young woman and Rochester and Jane have a baby boy, and by miracle Rochester actually gains sight in one eye so he can see his boy being born and growing up. Jane then writes to the Rivers and they write back saying that Sinjin went to India but never came back. Jane ends the novel with a quote from Sinjin's last letter in which he predicted his own death. So basically from this we decide that Sinjin's died and hopefully he's gone to heaven. So that is a summary of the whole novel in less than 20 minutes. I'm thinking about making some videos about the themes within Jane Eyre, so if you've got any ideas for which themes to do, just comment below with them. Hopefully I didn't go too fast and it's just giving you a good recap of the novel so you can just remember what's going on. Hope the exam goes well. Have a lovely day. Bye.